Thank you very much. I thought I probably ought to begin with an apology, because I'm neither, whoops, oh, just going the wrong way. Oh, no, what's going on? Which way are we going? Oh, that's better. I'm neither a psychiatrist nor even a medic. I'm not even a biologist. I don't think I technically have any qualifications in science after 15, and they weren't good. What I was a philosopher. So I was glad to see some philosophy representation here. The great thing about philosophers, so I'm not an expert in any of your fields, but by dint of being a philosopher, I'm entitled to be an expert in all your fields, is the important thing. And that possibly accounts for why I skate so gaily across with complete refusal to pay any attention to other people's precious theories and stuff. And I just sort of spread across all these disciplines and try to marshal them into some sort of coherent focus. So I'll just start this very briefly with a reminder about the evolutionary framing that we need to think of in terms of things social, particularly in species that are intensely social, like particularly the anthropoid primates, a few other birds and mammals, but mainly the anthropoid primates and obviously especially humans. So conventionally, evolutionary studies would focus on the benefit essentially to the individual. So you're looking at adaptations that come through what the individual does. Birds with longer tails mate more often or lay more eggs or whatever it is. So there's a direct link there. The problem once you get into sociality is that group living is actually a stepping stone for these animals, these species, on the way to maximizing fitness. So in effect, what's happened is an extra link, causal link has been put in the evolutionary chain. So they're all trying to maximize their fitness in particular environments. They're trying to solve ecological problems, but whereas most species are solving those ecological problems directly, how do I forage optimally? How do I avoid predators, whatever it may be? Primates in particular, a few other groups, form groups primarily for protection against predators. It's the principal defense against predators for all mammals and birds. And what they're having to do, their fitness component is proximally trying to solve the problem of group cohesion. That's the central group coordination, if you like. That's the central problem they're trying to solve. Because if they can get that right, it gives them a freebie on solving the ecological problems. So they're not solving ecological problems directly. They're doing so indirectly. It's very important. That's come to be known in kind of evolutionary biology as group level selection or group augmentation selection, not to be confused with group selection, which is we off the boat to speak about. But there are well-known examples. They have things like cooperative hunting are obvious examples of that, or group defense. But primarily, group formation is there to solve an ecological problem for them. That problem might actually be foraging efficiency, but most of the time it might be protection against conspecifics in other groups, raiding neighbors, which is probably the major problem humans have had to deal with. The problem with living in groups is it's extremely stressful, extremely so, in two completely separate directions. One is that kind of stuff goes on all the time because people will insist on arguing with each other and coming to fisticuffs. And then there's a bunch of social pressures that emerge simply from being crammed together. This is what I call the London commuter problem, kind of being jostled constantly. It says that this kind of stuff on the right-hand side usually involves some physical fighting and very, very disruptive. This kind of side is much more subtle. It's essentially psychological pressure creating stresses. And these forces are extremely strong, and particularly so because there's no why would you live in a group if you're ending up fighting all the time with other people? It's this story of Pitcairn Island and the mutineers on the Bounty, really. But equally badly, the just general stresses from being crammed together in a space have dramatic effects on our stress levels. And so nowhere is that clearer than in the case of female menstrual endocrinology. So if you look across the whole of the mammals, what you find is that fertility declines steeply with size of group, but it turns out actually it's primarily due to the females. Whatever the females are doing to each other is causing the menstrual endocrinologists to shut down. Females become infertile, so much so that particularly these rather solitary species up here, those kind of less social mammals, cannot live in permanent groups with more than 5 females in them. Simply can't be done, because everybody would be infertile after that. This is also affecting the male fertility for the same reason, but it's just less conspicuous, obviously, because it's less easy to measure what male reproductive output is actually like. So there's a big problem in domestic stock. It took the veterinarians and the farmers decades to realize that the reason why their cows in particular were producing very much milk was not they weren't feeding them enough because they were pouring food in. It was there were too many cows in the field. And they were running into this, what we call the infertility trap. The only way you can break out of it and form big groups is either to do fission fusion sociality, which is things like deer and antelope and stuff, do herding animals. So herds break up, come together when there's a threat they need to control. Once the threat has passed, they come to disperse again. Or you form these bonded social groups, which are primarily what the monkeys and apes and some of these do, the horses, these guys, the meerkats. They form permanently bonded groups, which allows them to shift the fertility curve to the right so that they can live in larger groups. And what you end up with is a hump-shaped fertility curve. So fertility is low if the group size is too small because they're not getting a big enough benefit from the size of group they're in. And it's low again at very large group sizes. And in between, it hits some maximum, and that maximum varies from species to species according to their local ecology and the intensity of how they manage their social relationships. So you have the main mechanism, though, is based on female-female coalitions. So although the females' interactions with each other are causing the infertility, their solution is actually to form largely matrilineal coalitions with females. And you can see these on the ground, as it were. There's little groups here of females grooming together, and the odd lone male not good enough to get a female. That's sort of keeping everybody away. It's kind of passive protection, because basically the way it's working is, occasionally they will line up and drive off a neighbor if they're becoming too intrusive. But most of this is just passive protection, because these guys recognize that they've got a lot of friends who will come to their aid if they push their luck too much. So it's actually quite a cognitive process that's involved. So bringing that round to humans, you might ask, well, can you have an infinite number of friends? Because in theory, protection or solving the ecological problems of survival and reproduction, successful survival and reproduction, is heavily dependent on living in large groups, but also living in large groups requires you to have large numbers of friends to protect you within the group. And this creates a sort of chain cascade where every time you try to increase the group size, what you end up doing is adding a new layer underneath, as it were, because of the problems that are created by the stresses. So to reduce the stress gives these groups very characteristic hierarchically structured groupings. this is the general pattern. These are the original data from the social brain hypothesis paper. Each of these is one genus. Originally, 30 years ago, we just assumed they were homogeneous data. And you stick a regression line through that. We're a little bit more sophisticated about how that was done. But essentially, it was just sticking a regression line through that. But it didn't take us long to realize, I think in 1993, which was the following year, I pointed out that it looked like there were separate grades within these data. They're not a homogeneous data. So it actually took us 25 years to figure out how to show this statistically. So only 5 years ago we managed to do that. So and you can see how tightly these different species cluster on these separate grades. They're a complete taxonomic mix. The only one that isn't is the apes over here. But the others are kind of a mix of monkeys and prosimians and new and old world monkeys, who don't belong together. But these sort of socio-cognitive grades seem to work. Now, the way things seem to operate is as you go from left to right, not only do you increase group size that the animals are living in, but you increase brain size and increase cognitive skills that the animals are using in managing their relationships. And what seems to have happened is essentially this sort of zigzag effect where in order to increase group size to manage more and more predator risky habitats, you can go so far up this trajectory, but you really hit a high point where things become utterly chaotic. So these two species up here live in notoriously chaotic social systems that nobody's ever been able to understand. So what you have to do is to move sideways by bringing into play a whole new bunch of hardware, new brain areas. And the principal transition from here to here, in particular, is the evolution of Brodmann areas 9 and 10 in the frontal pole here, which allow monkeys uniquely, this is unique to the anthropoid monkeys and apes, and it allows them uniquely to do things like one-trial learning, so they can infer a rule from a single observation, causal reasoning, analogical reasoning, playing two different videotapes into the future to be able to compare two different strategies, outcomes of two different strategies. These are all peculiar cognitive abilities to this group, the anthropoid monkeys and apes. But as you go further over, you're getting more and more stuff pulled in. And particularly what turns out to be particularly important is the capacity to inhibit prepotent responses, not to grab the biggest piece of cake on the plate, or to be incredibly polite to Professor Nessie. And that's allowing them to manage the cohesion of groups so that the groups don't get broken up by these very, very strong internal forces. If we plug humans into the right grade, which is what everybody fails to do, if we plug them into the grade to which they in fact belong, let's say the apes, then we get this mysterious prediction of 150 people as our natural grouping size. There's huge quantities of evidence now that that is a natural grouping size for humans. These are one of our, and most of these are huge databases. So this is one of our telephone call databases. It's an entire year's logs for one provider in one very large European country. It's 20% of the entire population are subscribers. I think it's, well, it says there, 6 million subscribers. That's all the little dots. These are the number of different people they call in the course of the year. Once we've pulled out kind of free phone numbers and those kind of business type numbers. And the average is very close to 145. And there's a lot of variance in here. You know, Randy has loads of friends. He's ringing them up all the time. This is me, Billy no mates down here. So a lot of variance. We know what a lot of that variance is about. Introverts versus extroverts, all sorts of things like that drive it. So we have a lot of data of this kind, but also there's a lot of casual data, some of which is really nice. Hunter-gatherer clans, 2 different data sets for hunter-gatherer clans gives us an average of 155. So these are not the living groups, these are dispersed living groups. Somebody had nothing better to do than record all the total number of attendees at American weddings for the last decade. You can download it if you want. The average number of people attending a wedding in the US over the last decade is 145. Turns up in the structure of military organization. It's the average size, typical size of the company, which is the basal unit on which all modern armies are structured. And then there are 2 absolutely fantastic historical data sets. One's the Doomsday Book here, which when the Normans conquered England in 1066, they thought they'd better find out how much tax they could extract. So they did a complete census of everything, every plough, every field, every hut, the lot. The only place they didn't include was the county of Durham, because that was a prince bishopric and was entirely independent of the state. And so it is a complete blank in the Doomsday Book. But there's an incredible comprehensive survey of the whole of England and Wales. And then there's an Italian data set for villages in the Alps, grazing associations in the Alps, and it spans 600 years from 1250 to 1850. And in that time, of course, the population size is increasing. Median grazing association size is remaining unbelievably stable at 145, because as the group villages get too big, they fission them. The average village size in the Doomsday Book is actually, county by county, 150. But I think the best data set of all is that notorious Facebook study. It was published in PNAS about 10 years or so ago, where they're feeding people false feeds to see what effect it had on their well-being and things, and their political posts as measured by their posts. They took 61 million Facebook pages. So there's a very decent chance that some of you are in there. Thank you very much for your contribution to science. But the average number of friends on Facebook is 149. And you don't often get predictions that come that close in biology. And I think on the strength of that, I can go past Go, collect my $200, and I'm going to buy both of Abramovich's yachts because he doesn't need them. And all future meetings of this grand association will be held on my yacht in the Caribbean. I wish. Anyway, what's at the heart of this? It turns out to be the default mode neural network, this huge bunch of wiring that connects up major areas. And the key areas in the end are the prefrontal cortex up here, which the frontal pole here is part and parcel of that, temporoparietal junction up in here, and the temporal lobe, but particularly the temporal pole down here, and then underneath into the limbic system, the amygdala, and underneath into the cerebellum at the back. And that whole complex is such a huge proportion of your neocortex and the immediate sort of subcortex bits that it explains essentially why we get the relationships with total brain size or total neocortex size. But you have to remember neocortex, well, I'm sure I don't need to tell you, neocortex is, your neocortex in particular, is a very, very large proportion of your brain. So in mammals, and it's essentially a mammal invention because birds don't actually have it, although some people have tried to claim they do. In basal mammals, it's about 10% of total brain volume. In the more advanced, socially more advanced mammals, like horses and carnivores and so on, it's about 40% maximum. It starts at 50% in prosimians and goes up through the apes, monkeys and apes, to 80% of total brain volume for humans. So the neocortex is the sort of major component of primate brain matter, if you like, and the default mode neural network plus its ancillary grey matter processing areas take up a very, very big chunk of that. So there's been a huge amount of neuroimaging going on over the last decade, which has unpacked all this. So why is your friends important in this context, and particularly for us as a sort of stepping back more into your territory? The last decade and a half maybe has produced this incredible tsunami of published papers showing that the single best predictor of your mental health and well-being, your physical health and well-being, even how long you survive into the future from today, is best predicted by the number and quality of close friendships you have. And that anything else plays a very small part in that. And it consistently comes up with the number 5. Now, if you think about the 150 you have, for friends and friends and family, is not a consistent group of people. It actually consists of a series of layers, and which I might point out back here. It turns out the layers for these species, not just for humans, but for other apes and monkeys that have multi-level societies with these layered structures, the layers sit on these lines, on these grades. They do not fall between them, right? And there's something very weird about these actual numbers that form these grades and their structure, because they turn out to be optima. We've shown mathematically that they are optimal. These particular numbers formed by the layers, which are 5, 5, 15. So you'd have 2 more grades down here for humans, or 3 more, 5, 15, 50, 150, 500, 1500. And we know there's a couple more layers beyond that. No, 1 more layer beyond that for humans. Those numbers are optimal points, structures for networks for information flow. Right? So in effect, what primates have been doing is jumping from one grade to the next. There's a big evolutionary valley in between where things fall apart. So you have to move very quickly from one grade to the next to get it. And they do it basically by fusing groups, smaller groups. Okay. So that what keeps coming up in these epidemiological data is the number 5, which is this small inner core, what we call the shoulders to cry on friends, which are the people who will drop everything to come to your support when your world falls apart. And again, as I said, typically 2 of those would be close family, 2 would be friends, and an odd one to make up the difference. But these are, I'm just going to show you 2 sets of data. This set of data, because it's a very large meta-analysis, nearly 150 epidemiological studies of essentially heart attack patients. So their measure is unbelievably hard-nosed. Did you survive for 12 months after your first heart attack? I can't argue that. Whereas usually what people are saying, did you feel happy yesterday or happier today than you felt a year ago? Well, who knows whether my happiness is the same as your happiness rating, or whether my happiness rating today bears any relationship to how I felt a year ago. But this is very, very hard-nosed. These are the effect sizes of the various things that they've looked at. So you've got network quality, which is a composite really of network size and quality of relationships, and then all the stuff that your friendly neighborhood GP worries about on your behalf, whether you smoke or not, how much exercise you have, how much alcohol you how much time you spend slobbing about in front of the television, whether how obese you are, the drug treatment you're on, the quality of the air where you lived. And the answer is these 2 way outweigh. It's not to say that what your doctor worries about is unimportant, you'll be glad to know. But if you want to solve your health problems and live a long, happy life, you can do no better than giving up smoking and getting 5 friends. The average is 5 friends. Varies according to things like personality somewhat, but typically on average 5 friends. So you can solve that problem and keep them, you're in good shape. And this is a very large prospective study we did. So the other one was a kind of retrospective study. This is a prospective study from 2 big waves done across 13 European countries. The total sample size is 38,000. All the subjects were 50-year-olds upwards. And the measures were what's your quality of life as you measure it today, and what's your quality of life as you measure it in 2 years' time. And again, the one you'll be interested in, do you have symptoms of depression, essentially? So it's looking at the change in quality of life over time and the change in the likelihood of developing symptoms of depression. And what turned out to be important, you could either have 5 friends or you could do 3 volunteering activities. So helping with the Boy Scouts, helping, I don't know, do the flowers for your local church, helping at some charity shop or even a political party maybe, something like that. Something which, if you think about it, is engaging in a social environment, right? And it turns out you can mix and match these 2, but you can't add them together. So you can either have 5 friends and no voluntary activities, or 3 voluntary activities and no friends, and you do just as well, or some mix of those 2. But you can't have 5 friends and 3 voluntary activities, and that's what creates this U-shaped curve here and there if you have too few. So this is adding the friends and the volunteering measures together. So there's a nice demonstration, I think, that of the impact of friendship, particularly on a psychiatric condition, but more importantly, just a reminder that it's the sociality, the social environment you put yourself in, and that actually, even if you're not very good at making friends, just going working in a social environment of people who are there as volunteers can be just as good. All right, now it turns out over the last decade we're picking up all the same signals from large numbers of studies of very social mammals. Most of them have been monkeys and apes, the social monkeys and apes, old world monkeys and apes. But the nice data from wild horses in New Zealand and from dolphins showing that females who have more friends, whom they, in the case of primates, groom with or associate with in the case of dolphins, recover faster from injuries they receive. They have lower stress levels, measuring their stress hormones. They live longer lives. They have higher birth rates. They have more of their offspring survive to adulthood, and as a consequence, more grandchildren. So there are massive selection effects on the capacity to form and hold on to friendships over time. So how do primates create friendships? It's a 2-process mechanism. So it involves 2 different bits of the brain operating in parallel with each other, doing slightly different things but in mutually reinforcing state. One is this stuff done by grooming. Grooming, it turns out, triggers an endorphin system in the brain. I'll show you how it does it in a minute. What it does is produce a sense of relaxation. Endorphins, obviously opioids. It comes from a contraction of endogenous morphine. Gives you a sense of relaxation and calmness and peace with the world and trust in whoever you're doing these activities with. And you can see animals literally go to sleep when they're being groomed, if they're being groomed for long enough. You're all very familiar with it, especially the ladies. Every time you go and have your hair done, you come out of it feeling wonderful. And you almost drop off to sleep under the manipulations of your hairdresser, massaging the scalp essentially. So what this does is set up an internal psychopharmacological platform off which the animals can build relationships, cognitive essentially relationships, the social brain bit, of trust and obligation and reciprocity. So these 2 are sort of pushing in the same direction and bouncing backwards and forwards between each other. Just to show you that we still do it. This is one of our many PET imaging studies that we've done with our collaborators in Finland. So this is people being put in the PET scanner, which is pretty miserable stuff because you're injecting radioactive dyes into them twice, because you have to do it before and an after. And then their partner is grooming them, and I hasten to add, this was all done in Finland Fins are not noted for getting excited about anything, and even so, they were instructed nothing above the neck and nothing below the belt, right? Just slow stroking on the torso. And this is the brain firing up, the receptor sites firing up in response to endorphin uptake. What's interesting about endorphins is not only does it create an intense sense of bonding, but it also stimulates the immune system, particularly the natural killer cells. The natural killer cells, I'm sure you know, target primarily viruses and some cancers. So you can now see a direct biochemical link into the fact that sociality is good for you, if you like, in pure physical medicine terms, never mind psychological medicine terms. Okay, this is how the system works. This was only discovered about a decade ago. Most peripheral nerves are of this kind. They are very fast, like the pain nerves, very fast. They go to the sensory motor cortex in the brain, and then there's a return loop coming down saying, for God's sakes, pull your hand away, right? What triggers the endorphin system is this other different kind of neuron, the afferent C tactiles, complete neuron set, which is very, very different. It is unmyelinated, so it's extremely slow. It goes to the insular cortex, which is one of the main areas triggering endorphins in the brain, and there is no return loop at all. And what seems to happen is it's the slow hand movements across the surface of the skin and the fur, but the skin just as well, because we still have the receptors at the base of the hair follicles, even if you don't have any hair, body hair. That movement of the skin triggers the receptors and they fire away. And what's interesting about them is they only respond to one stimulus, and that is light, slow stroking at exactly 3 centimeters a second. If you stroke faster than that or slower than that, they do not respond at all. And 3 centimeters a second is roughly the speed of hand movements when you're grooming. Of course, we still do a lot of that. We don't have the fur to go through, where you can see mothers doing it with toddlers sitting in front of them and start fiddling with their hair, very like primate grooming. What we've done is transpose that into what's now called soft touch in this area, stroking, patting, cuddling, hugging, all these kind of things trigger this system. So we still use it, it's there. But our problem is we started to live in size of groups which are much too big and are beyond the capacity for physical touch to operate, because that's so dependent on intimacy. Right? So that, it turns out, grooming in humans and in primates has an upper limit of group sizes you can bond at about 50 individuals. And to get beyond that, which is what we eventually did, we had to introduce a bunch of things which all turn out, as we've shown this both with neuroimaging studies and with naltrexone blocker experiments, and with pain threshold change experiments and so on. They all kick the endorphin system in, and they all create this sense of bonding with the people you do. The earliest one is certainly laughter. We share it with great apes, except that we've modified it so that it exaggerates the stress put on the lungs and the diaphragm and so on in a way that triggers the endorphin system. Singing and dancing, music in effect. Singing without words seemed to have come in at about 500,000 years ago with the appearance of archaic humans. Then once you had language, as we have it now, fully evolved language, you had the rituals of religion, feasting, eating and drinking alcohol. Alcohol is a very good trigger of the endorphin system. It's not alcohol you get addicted to, that's a poison. It's the endorphins. So as I'm sure you all know, if you go to Alcoholics Clinic, what they give you is endorphin blockers. So you don't get the benefit and you get weaned off it. Feasting, And I think any astringent type drinks will do it too. I think that's why coffee is so popular. And emotional storytelling. Emotional storytelling is very good at lifting people. It creates sense. So just, I guess, the takeaway message is a social world is very, very small scale and still is. Social life is extremely stressful, as if none of us knew that. But apparently nobody understood really just how stressful it actually is, even in the normal course of life. And our friends matter massively to our personal health and well-being. And friendships are extremely costly to maintain because you have to invest vast amount of time in them. So we devote 40% of our total social effort to just 5 people, those 5 people in the inner core of shoulders to cry on friends, and another 20% to the 10 people in the next layer that make up the next layer. So 15 people account for 60% of our total social effort. But also they're extremely costly in terms of cognition because you're trying to forecast what people are doing. You're not trying to outwit them. This is not Machiavellian intelligence. That's a byproduct. But what it is trying to understand how to keep relationships going rather than causing them to break asunder. Thank you very much.